I am far more certain that any sort of offensive activity, any dead American boys, you've got a war.
Pearl Harbor's a vanity project for the Imperial Japanese Navy, in my view. They want to show what they can do.
If I'm the Japanese and I get word that the American battle fleet has raised steam and actually sallied forth from the harbor entrance, I've got spittle running down my chin.
I think any attack by the Japanese on anything that relates to vital American interests triggers the war, to tell you the truth.
I discount that they would have actually gone for an invasion attempt against the Hawaiian Islands, because Hawaii, there ain't no oil in Hawaii.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler says, right, we're going to declare war on the United States. Didn't have to do it. He did not have to do it.
This whole business of American neutrality is looking pretty flimsy at this point. It's clear that the Americans are on the British side. So I think there's going to be a war with Germany. I just don't know when that's going to happen.
It's December 1941, and the United States is still not on a military footing in the Second World War. An isolationist, never-again sentiment after World War I, public opinion, and the economic situation at home saw the US merely provide the Allies with the supplies and assistance they needed from 1940. Yet, in the Pacific, tensions with Japan have been growing for the best part of a decade. Japanese expansionism saw invasions of Manchuria and French Indochina. And on the 7th of December, 1941, Japanese Admiral Yamamoto made a critical decision to gain further control of the Western Pacific. A deadly surprise attack on the US Naval base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was supposed to be a preventative action, yet just a day later the US declared war on Japan and joined the Allied effort for the remainder of World War II. I'm James Hansen, and welcome to History Undone, a history show with a difference, where we explore how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Each episode will focus on a different historical battle, and with the help of our experts, we'll examine how split-second decisions tip the balance with dramatic consequences. All you have to do is watch, share, and subscribe to History Undone with James Hansen on YouTube. Today, it's the attack on Pearl Harbor, a devastating defeat for the United States that saw more than 2,400 service members tragically lose their lives. Yet it was also a true turning point for both the war effort and history itself. Joining me once again is the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and from the US, the World War II scholar Jonathan Parshall. Welcome to you both. And we should say, if you haven't had a chance to watch these two undoing the Battle of Midway in a previous episode, there should be a link for you on the screen right now to go back and watch it. So before we get into what happened on that fateful day, John, I wonder if you can just set the scene for us as to where we are in the Pacific and what Japan are up to at this point in 1941.
Sure. Basically, even though the Americans obviously very much over-focus on Pearl Harbor is a subsidiary operation designed to protect the eastern flank of a Japanese advance that is aimed to the south. The reason they're going to war is for economic purposes. Among other things, the most important thing is getting oil. And the oil that they need is in places like Borneo, Java, and Sumatra. So they're going to be doing a very complex plan of campaign that's aimed in that southern direction. They're going to be landing troops all over the place. They're going to be putting troops in Malaya. They're going to be putting troops in the Philippines. And so what Pearl Harbor is designed to do is to knock out the American battle fleet and make sure that it cannot sally forth and, counterattack across the Central Pacific into the flank of this advance. Hopefully by putting out of business the American battle line, they'll, get rid of those entanglements. And the other sort of important goal here is this is a blow aimed at American morale. Can we somehow upset and demoralize the Americans sufficiently by knocking out their battleships that they'll decide that, you know what, we don't want to get involved in this war with Japan. We're just going to turn and face the Germans, and that's going to be our war plan.
And we have a map in front of us, which technically is of the Japanese area of influence in 1942, but it lays out the state of play pretty well. And obviously, you've got Pearl Harbor here. Chris Parry, to bring you in, I mean, John's right. Essentially, Japan is thinking they've got to attack the US in some way, shape or form because they need resources and they think it's a way of stifling them.
Well, it is by no means a foregone conclusion. As John pointed out, they need to get these resources down here. And you've got the American-dominated Philippine Islands here. And so what you've got to do is say, well, if we're going to go for that, if we're going to use that as a main supply route, we're already occupying Indochina because the Vichy French have let us do that. Do we really want these islands here in our flank, even if the United States doesn't respond to what we're doing here? So they make the decision that they need to take the Philippines as well, Guam, and Wake Island as part of that. So even if they don't attack Pearl Harbor, they've significantly overridden American interests. And of course, you've got substantial American troops and aviation here as well, and submarines in the Philippines. So, you know, the Americans aren't going to be very happy about that. The critical issue here is whether, had they not attacked Pearl Harbor, there'd have been enough indignation, if you like, from the American public to get it through Congress. Because it's all very well Roosevelt saying, well, actually, if the Philippines are attacked, then obviously we have an interest. What is really intriguing is that when Churchill and the Dutch were saying to the Americans, look, we think the Japanese are probably going to go for this, Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, Roosevelt said, look, we're going to come to your aid. Be in no doubt. He didn't say it publicly, but he said privately, we will come to your aid if there's an issue. What compounds that, of course, is the invasion of the Philippine Islands, Guam and Wake. But the thing that I always wonder is if you don't attack Pearl Harbor, if you don't attack essentially a state of the United States, does Congress come in behind Roosevelt and say, yeah, you go for it? The other thing we have to remember, of course, is Germany's not in the frame until Pearl Harbor. It's not until the Germans 4 days after Pearl Harbor say, well, okay, the Japanese have given the Americans what we think is a knockout blow as well, so we're going to declare war in accordance with the tripartite pact. So you haven't even got Germany in on the game at this stage. So Pearl Harbor is pretty significant.
I love this. We're barely 5 minutes in. Already we're doing the what ifs. We will unpick all the history, undo all the history in a moment. Let's zoom in now and let's talk about the events of the 7th of December, 1941. Well, before us now, we have a new map of Oahu, and we're going to go through what happened on the day with the attack on Pearl Harbor in just a moment. John, though, I just want to bring you in on something Chris said a moment ago. In terms of Japan's mindset going into the attack on Pearl Harbor and why they decided it was required. I mean, they had war-gamed various different strategies as to, you know, where they go, hadn't they?
Yeah, that's right. So the Japanese, before the war, had tried to determine, you know, what would happen if we just launch a war against either the British in isolation or the Dutch in isolation, the Americans in isolation. And the conclusion that they had come to was that if we get into a war with any one of these three powers, we inevitably end up with a war against all three, which means that if you're going to do that, we should then use the advantages of being able to pick and choose the place and timing of our attack and just attack all three of these powers simultaneously. The other thing I wanted to add is that the Philippines are like a dagger at the throat of Japanese supply lines, because all the goodies that they're hoping to grab down in the southern resource area have got to come back via ship to Japan to be processed. So there's no way that any classically trained military mind is going to leave the Philippines unreduced and uncaptured. So it's absolutely guaranteed that they're going to attack the Americans in the Philippines. And if you do that, you get a war.
Well, Chris Parry, Pearl Harbor obviously is here on this map of Oahu. Why is Pearl Harbor so important to the Americans?
Essentially, as things were developing in the Pacific, particularly more aggressive tendencies by the Japanese trying to break out from this economic blockade that's been imposed against them, President Roosevelt thinks, look, in order to deter any aggression by the Japanese, we'll forward deploy our fleet from the west coast of the United States and put them into Hawaii. This actually creates quite a lot of resistance from the high command of the US Navy. In fact, Admiral Richardson says, there's real political impact if you do this, and implies that Roosevelt will suffer electorally if he makes this decision. And the sailors themselves aren't very happy at all. But Richardson is eased out pretty quickly in the following months and is replaced by Admiral Kimmel, who is in command on the day of the Pearl Harbor strike. But essentially what the American fleet is doing there is trying to deter, by being forward present, any Japanese moves. It's quite interesting really, because what you've got there is a combination of fairly old, slow battleships and also carriers, 3 carrier groups at the moment. Now, the Americans have already decided, actually, that their plan for sending battleships across the Pacific to confront the Japanese is not actually a good one, because they're a bit slow and they're very thirsty on fuel. So they're thinking about some procurement that's coming on down the line called fast battleships. They're going to come in later in the war, and also a whole generation of new carriers called the Essex class that come in. So they're really caught in between an old Navy and a new one. The Japanese still think that the American fleet is going to sortie forward, and they're going to, use an American expression, attrit it on the way with submarines and aircraft that are based on some of the islands that they occupy in the Pacific. And then the Japanese fleet will sortie and deal with the remainder when they get across to the other side. But in terms of being forward deployed like this is a deterrent posture, not a defense posture.
John Marshall, talk us through the waves of attack that the Japanese pursued on that day.
Yeah, so basically what they're going to do here is they're going to put up 2 separate attack waves. And the first one has got about 180 some aircraft. To the Japanese mind, it is extremely important that they not only attack the anchorage, but they also need to suppress the air power that is on Oahu. And so if you actually do a breakdown of how they're using their aircraft, about half of those planes are going to be dedicated to hitting airfields and doing strafing attacks against our fighters and that kind of stuff, because they really don't want the Americans to be able to reach out and touch their carrier force with our aircraft. Meanwhile, the remainder of those planes are going to be going after, in the first wave, are going to be going after the harbor using torpedoes and also high-level bombs, big armor-piercing bombs that should be able to get through the armored plate of the inner battleships. Because you've got Battleship Row that's got, the battleships lined up 2 by 2. The ones on the outside you can potentially hit with torpedoes, and they've got specially modified torpedoes that can run at a shallow depth that should be able to operate within the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. But then the inboard battleships, they've got to hit those as well. And so what they've done is they've taken 16-inch naval shells and they've machined them down and turned them into these really heavy armor-piercing bombs. So there's going to be one group of Kates, which are their torpedo/level bomber, that are going to be coming in and using torpedoes against the outboard battleships. There's a second wave of Kates that are going to be parading overhead at about 3,000 meters that are going to be dropping these heavy armor-piercing bombs and going after the inboard battleships. Then after that first attack wave is done, they're going to send a second attack wave in that's only slightly smaller. They're going to be bringing in a large group of dive bombers that are going to hit Pearl Harbor. And they're also going to be using a second wave of attacks to follow up against some of the other airfields like Kaneohe. So, it's an impressively large, coordinated attack. It is going to go after every airfield on Oahu simultaneously and also hit the anchorage.
So, Chris, why did the Americans not detect it? I mean, when we talked in our Battle of Midway episode, we talked about, the intelligence that the US had then. Why not now?
Oh, it's very complicated. And what you've got is a situation here where all the dots are available to the Americans, but they don't join them up, to tell you the truth. There's a conceptual problem. All through the year, everybody is saying, you know what, if the Japanese are going to attack us, they might attack us at Pearl Harbor. And this is going on for the best part of 1941. During fleet exercises in the 1930s, right up until 1938, the Americans had actually practiced a carrier attack on Pearl Harbor. And you get a situation where what the Americans can't conceive of is a 6-carrier battle group arriving undetected off Hawaii and attacking. And Admiral Kimmel, the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, later on in an interview said, "I never believed those yellow-bellied bastards could actually attack us here in Hawaii."
Right.
He actually says that. So you're underestimating your enemy for a start. And that's the first problem. Secondly, the Japanese actually have got some agency here. They conduct a very good deception campaign, such that their 6 carriers are totally lost to American signals intelligence right up until the time of the attack. And they just don't know where they are. And there's a good deception operation. There's a lot of noise going on with regard to the attacks on Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. And everybody assumes that the carriers are in basically Japanese home waters, because that's what their doctrine was. Because what we'll do is we'll attack in the south, we'll leave our main carrier fleet to actually attack the Americans if they come to support the Philippines and everything else. So there's this idea that actually it's not possible. That's the first thing. Secondly, we're getting no intelligence about the carriers at all. There's another problem. The air defense of Hawaii is actually in the hands of the Army. So the Army is responsible for the air defense of Pearl Harbor, not the Navy. It gets worse. Essentially, the Navy is responsible for the very wide area surveillance. The Army is responsible for close-in surveillance by air. And so you've got this disunity of command between General Short and Admiral Kimmel. The final point is that Admiral Kimmel is what I would call an authoritarian commander. He's worried about detail. The day before, he's going through the sort of shell usage of his ships, line by line, to make sure they're being used properly. He's not thinking about the big picture. The other issue is they're getting a series of war warnings up until Pearl Harbor, and everything in the intelligence messages is focused on Malaya, it's focused on the East Indies, it's focused on the Philippines, and people aren't mentioning Pearl Harbor. The other issue is that CINCPAC, Kimmel, is not getting all the secret signals that are coming into Washington that people are seeing. And the most important issue is people aren't ready for war. They're not in that mentality. And you get a situation where even just before the attack, there are 3 opportunities to detect the incoming raid. In the first case, the Japanese launch a couple of float planes to do surveillance on Hawaii. They are detected on radar, but nobody actually links it up. There are 2 trainee soldiers here at a radar station that's just been set up in the north. They detect an incoming raid, this first raid here, 740 raid, and they report it to Hawaii. There's a chap called Kermit Tyler, who basically is just sitting in. He's sitting in for a mate. And they say, look, we've got this concentration of aircraft coming in. And Kermit Tyler says, well, actually, we've got some B-17s coming in from the West Coast, probably them, disregard. So they actually detect the raid something like 40 minutes before. And then finally, you get a situation where some patrolling ships here, including a destroyer and a minesweeper, detect Japanese midget submarines trying to penetrate the harbor with torpedoes that have been launched from a bigger Japanese submarine out here. So there were 3 opportunities actually to detect this raid coming in, which were totally ignored. The dots weren't joined up. And to compound it, Washington knew this was going to happen because they'd actually decoded the Japanese diplomatic telegram. Indeed, they only had 13 parts of a 14-part message the night before, but Roosevelt said, this means war. But everybody's thinking Philippines, they're thinking something happening over there. The following morning, they realize the Japanese are going to attack on a broad front. And what they do is they warn the Philippines, they warn Panama, and I'm afraid to say they think, better not pick up the telephone in case it compromises our communication. So they send a telegram by Western Union to actually warn Pearl Harbor. That telegram arrives just 30 minutes before and is on its way by bicycle to Admiral Kimmel just at the point the first raid comes in.
Well, we're going to come back and talk more about the intelligence and what the implications could have been had it been handled differently when we get to our what if section, when we start undoing the history. But just to focus on the real history, John. Talk us through the speed of the Japanese attack and how important was that? Because what, 4 battleships destroyed in the first 4 minutes?
Yeah, that's right. If you look at just the tactical plan for the anchorage as a whole, it's extremely complex. These torpedo planes were supposed to be coming in from all directions, and yes, they're going to hit the American battle line absolutely at the outset, and then follow up with these level bombers that are going to hit the inboard battleships. And so at the end of the day, the Americans have no warning that this is coming. I've stood on the deck of the USS Missouri, which is anchored in Pearl Harbor, and have looked out over the waters of the Southeast Lock and just sort of imagined what it must have been like to be an American sailor standing on the deck that morning, and suddenly, these torpedo planes appear coming up the Southeast Lock. You've got 5 or 6 seconds before these dudes are on top of you, and they're coming in, one at a time, boom, 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 dropping their fish and roaring away. It's just absolutely flabbergasting. There was really no time to react at all before these torpedoes start hitting the sides of these ships. And very, very quickly, all hell breaks loose.
So just give us a sense very briefly, John, of the overall scale of the damage sustained by the Americans.
Yeah, so the initial attack ends up doing in the battleships Oklahoma and West Virginia via torpedo attacks. They're sunk basically outright. The California, likewise, is hit by torpedoes, not quite as many of them, and it's going to take longer to sink, but eventually it is going to, end up on the bottom with its decks awash. The most catastrophic loss is from one of these high-level armor-piercing bombs that hits the battleship Arizona, and its forward magazine detonates, destroys the ship, and kills 1,500 crewmen, within the blink of an eye. So, by the end of this first attack, 4 battleships have been sunk. And according to, the orders that have been given to Admiral Nagumo, who's the commander of the carrier task force, that actually fulfills his mission right there. His goal was to sink 4 battleships, because you have to put yourself back in the mentality of 80 years ago, before the carrier had become sort of the ascendant weapon system within this war. The battleship really was the coin of the realm in terms of how we measured naval power. And given the fact that the Americans have only got 14 or 15 battleships to their name at this point, the sinking of 4 of those, that's tantamount to a national catastrophe. So the first wave attack is really very, very successful.
Well, that's the real history of the 7th of December 1941 and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now it's time to undo all of that. This is History Undone. Well, Chris Parry, let's talk about the intelligence first of all. I mean, if the Americans knew it was coming, and if the intelligence had reached Pearl Harbor in time, which is the crucial point you were describing earlier, what changes?
Well, it's really interesting because Admiral Nagumo had the orders that if he'd been detected up to 2 days before, then he was to abandon the Enterprise and go away. Up to 24 hours before, it was down to him. Now, let's just say the Americans had actually detected it and sortied their battleships at this point. So you've got a 6-carrier battle group, Japanese battle group here. And I'm thinking I've got 6 very slow battleships here that I can take on in the open waters. The American carriers are nowhere to be seen, because one thing we have to remember is that all 3 Pac Fleet operational carriers are out doing other jobs at the moment. In fact, one of the carriers is due to return pretty soon and nearly gets mixed up in all of this. But they're out and about doing all sorts of delivery and training tasks. So they're absent. And of course, for the Japanese aviators, that's incredibly disappointing. Now, had the Americans detected the incoming raid, they would have been alerted, of course, in terms of air defense. They would have been able to disperse their aircraft. One of the things General Short was obsessed by was that actually Japanese people living in Hawaii would sabotage his aircraft. So he bunched them all together on the airfields, wingtip to wingtip, which were perfect targets for the Japanese. They didn't disperse them. So the aircraft would have been dispersed. You'd have had combat air patrol up on pretty regular basis during daylight hours. You'd have had your search planes out looking for the Japanese fleet. But if you're Admiral Kimmel, what are you going to do? Are you going to sit here and let yourself be defended and have your ships actually at action stations? Or are you going to sortie out? Because I tell you, as a naval commander, if I've got 6 carriers and their air groups and I've got 6 battleships at sea, I'm going to put them on the bottom. It's as simple as that. It would have been Prince of Wales and Repulse times 3. Yeah. And what we have to bear in mind is that 4 of these battleships were salvaged and put back into the fight again later in the war, where they're used for shore bombardment. So you've got a real problem, even if you detect it. What I would have done, if it had been me, I'd have sent them to the West Coast. I'd have said, we'll make this into a fortress. Let's see what we can take. But I'd have had most of my big ships heading east back to the West Coast.
That is fascinating. John, do you agree with that?
Well, I was just going to say, I do agree with elements of that. If I'm the Japanese and I get word that the American battle fleet has raised steam and actually sallied forth from the harbor entrance, I've got spittle running down my chin because that is such a beautiful target for me. Now I can offload the level bombs from that group of Kates. I can put torpedoes on them. I'm going to put torpedoes on some of the torpedo planes on Shokaku and Zuikaku, which had been going after airfields instead. I'm going to come after the Americans with the better part of 100 torpedo planes, and I'm going to sink all of those battleships. Thank you very much. And as you say, Chris, I'm going to sink them in deep water. You're never going to get those things back. And the body count could be even worse. So, yeah, I think it all depends on how much warning time you've got. If you've only got, an hour or something like that, I don't think it behooves the Americans at all to try to get out of the harbor. You just go to action stations, make sure that your anti-aircraft weapons are fully manned, and you kind of gut it out there in the harbor. I think that's the best option for the Americans.
And John, you don't want a situation where you've got battle wagons going through that very narrow harbor entrance, and if you get one sunk, one sunk there, it's a real problem.
Yeah, and no. There's actually a myth around that if you actually look at the width of the harbor mouth, yes, the Japanese historically tried very hard to sink the battleship Nevada, which was raising steam and was trying to exit the harbor. But ex post facto analyses of the width of the harbor mouth make it clear that one battleship alone is not going to block that channel. You'd have probably needed 2 at least to be sunk in there before it'd have any effect.
It's really interesting, this whole point about how what was obviously a devastating attack on the Americans could have been even worse. Chris Parry, what if the Japanese had sunk one of the carriers?
Oh, well, I mean, one of the carriers, not a problem. But I think one of the issues here is the Japanese did the Americans a favor by sinking the battleships, because as John said earlier, these were the royal family of warships. So what they did by sinking the battle fleet was saying, look, you've only got your carriers. So therefore, the Americans immediately said, fine, we'll go in for carrier aviation. We'll take the Japanese on at their own game. We can actually produce them quicker than they can. We can actually produce the air crews and also the aircraft quicker than they can. So thanks very much. You've actually told us that our doctrine is wrong. We'll now go for carrier aviation. And guess what? We can do it 10 times better than you can. And the whole Pacific War is about the transition of the Americans, which I think was underway anyway. The Americans have realized their slow battleships weren't up for this. As I said, the 1938 estimates had these fast battleships and also these fast carriers coming in, which then took them forward. But essentially, we've still got American carriers today, going around the Pacific, what I call the long, calm lee of Midway. They're still looking for Japanese carriers.
But John, let's say the carriers have been destroyed. I mean, I know that's proper worst case scenario, but if that happened, I mean, could Midway then have happened, or do you think that's unfeasible?
Yeah, okay. So again, we sort of have to quantify, what does defeat look like? We had 3 carriers in the Pacific at this point, and I don't think there's any way that there would have been any more than 2 destroyed. I mean, you could make a case that maybe Enterprise and Lexington buy it in the harbor. That's bad for us. I mean, yes, we've got a lot of new carriers on the building ways, but those are not going to be showing up. The first of those Essex-class carriers is not commissioned until December of 1942. So without the requisite carrier force, no, a Midway doesn't end up necessarily happening. And then even more important in my estimation is you don't get a Guadalcanal campaign in the middle to the end of 1942, which is really the decisive Pacific campaign. So yeah, losing carriers is bad. Any way you slice it, it's bad for the Americans because it ends up retarding our ability to initiate the kind of war that we want to initiate and has downstream effects that are, unknowable, incalculable, but probably not good.
John, could the Japanese have gone for a third wave of attack and gone after the fuel tanks?
There's a huge debate about that in the scholarly literature. Actually, a very fine British historian, H.P. Wilmot, made the argument that probably not. I'm ambivalent on that. Yes, they probably could have done a third attack wave. I think it probably would have had to have happened later on in the afternoon. But one thing we need to just do away with from a mythology standpoint is this carrier force has no ability to just like stand off of Hawaii for multiple days at a time and beat this place into submission. The logistics just aren't there to do that. They made this very high-speed dash down to do their initial attacks. They're going to have to turn around on December 7th and head back north because they got to meet up with their oilers. It's 3,500 nautical miles from Tokyo to Oahu. So they're at the absolute end of their logistical tether to do this raid. So maybe one more attack wave can come in. And then the question becomes, what do I hit?
Okay, well, let's start talking about the big what-ifs. Had Pearl Harbor never happened, Chris Parry, had the Japanese decided against it, what are the long-term consequences? Does the US even enter the Second World War?
Well, I think we said earlier, and Jonathan's actually confirmed it, is that had the Japanese attacked the Philippines, which they did, had they taken Guam, Wake Island, then the Americans were pretty much committed. They were also committed to their allies, the Dutch and the British, to get involved. And I think the American balance would have been, if we don't get involved now, when is it going to be? When the Japanese are really far forward? So if we don't actually engage, then it's going to be a problem for us because the ability to react would have been very, very short, to tell you the truth, in those circumstances. The important thing, of course, is would Roosevelt have got it through Congress without the shock of Pearl Harbor? It may be that people in Congress would have thought, well, okay, Philippines are way over there. Is that a big deal? I think enough American assets in terms of the land forces, the aviation, the Asiatic fleet that was sitting in the Philippines would have been engaged. A lot would have been going on around them. And I suspect Congress would have passed that even without the attack, to tell you the truth. I don't think it makes a difference. I think where it has made a
100%.
difference, where it has made a difference is that the Japanese actually thinking that actually this would be a knockout blow. It hasn't been. And the army in Japan immediately says to Yamamoto, well, that didn't work, did it? And so they lose a bit of faith in the Navy's ability to actually do this strategic stuff at this point. And of course, what it leads directly to later, as Jonathan hinted at, is the ability of the Americans not only to start the campaign in the Pacific, but also defend the Australia-America link that is so vital. It means because the carriers aren't in Pearl Harbor, they can engage in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Guadalcanal campaign is possible, and more importantly, Midway as well. I mean, what I find interesting is the original Japanese plan actually had an invasion force attached to it as well. And had the Japanese followed this up, and given the supply difficulties and the overcomplicated plan that the Japanese had, that's probably not viable. So they were sensible to make that. But what if they'd had an invasion force alongside this attack? What would have happened? So, the Japanese front line would have been far forward, but they rejected that.
John, where do you stand on an invasion?
I am profoundly skeptical of that. You're right that some versions of the Navy plan had in mind that, yes, we'd like to take Oahu, but the Army was never going to go for that because the main thrust of this war is to the south,
Correct.
and the Japanese only have a certain amount of amphibious lift capability. They can only move around about 2, maybe 3 divisions at a time. And so if you come to me and say, hey, I want to invade Hawaii, something's got to give, and that means that then they probably don't have the lift to put the initial group of troops into Malaya, which is kind of the crucial ground campaign at the beginning of this war, is to take Singapore. And, then do you end up not getting the result where you end up getting the oil? Because if you give the British more time to build up in Malaya, among other things, the 18th Infantry Division is on ships and ends up getting landed in Singapore just days before the actual historical collapse. And so you could get a much more protracted ground campaign here, which maybe ultimately doesn't end up getting you the oil that you went to war for in the first place. So I discount that they would have actually gone for an invasion attempt against the Hawaiian Islands, because Hawaii, there ain't no oil in Hawaii, and that's not the main reason we're going for war.
Well, as we're talking about the wider region, let's zoom out again. Let's look at the Pacific and let's explore some more what-ifs. Well, we're looking at the wider Pacific region now. I think what's really interesting is are we almost saying, Dr. Chris Parry, that any attack on Pearl Harbor would have prompted Roosevelt to push for a declaration of war? Whether that would have been approved or not is a big question. But realistically, the Americans are triggered into declaring war on Japan the moment the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor.
No, I think any attack by the Japanese on anything that relates to vital American interests triggers the war, to tell you the truth. Pearl Harbor's a vanity project for the Imperial Japanese Navy, in my view. They want to show what they can do. They want to take out the American battlefield. There's a fundamental misunderstanding about the American psyche here. The Japanese think the Americans are soft, they're weak, they're decadent. They're not going to respond if we give them a knockout blow. It's a bit like Barbarossa, really. We'll give them a punch, everything will collapse. Well, didn't happen. Right. The Americans are absolutely energized and empowered by it. But the fact of life is, had the Japanese attacked the Philippines, Guam, or Wake Island, you might have got away with it. I don't think the American Congress would have gone to war over Wake Island, but certainly the Philippines. And I think at some stage the Americans would have made the assessment: look, the Japanese are on the war path. They mean war in our direction. We've got all sorts of issues in the Central Pacific that we need to resolve in relation to where they're building airfields and things like that. We've got to maintain the link with Australia. And in any case, a lot of our war plans say we're going to go through the Central Pacific and also up through the South Pacific as well. So if it's going to happen, let's do it at a time of our strength, not at a time when the Japanese are really on top.
John, let's bring you in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I am far more certain that any sort of offensive activity, any dead American boys, you've got a war. And one of the sort of the classic conspiracy theories about this whole thing is, that this was a plot by Roosevelt. If I let them attack Pearl Harbor, that'll bring us into the war. Man, I'm here to tell you there are a lot more efficient ways to going about getting a declaration than having half your battle fleet wrecked in a harbor. All you would have needed to do is send one American destroyer out of the Philippines to snoop some of those invasion convoys that were moving south to places like Malaya, and the Japanese are going to sink that ship, and you've got yourself a war. Certainly any direct attack against the Philippines. We have an entire division in the Philippines, and a lot of aircraft and submarines too, as Chris noted. You attack the Philippines, you got a war for sure.
I think the critical thing here, James, is the effect on the broader tripartite alliance, because after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler says, right, we're going to declare war on the United States. Didn't have to do it. He did not have to do it. And so we get a critical situation where Roosevelt actually gets both wars he wants, against Japan and against Germany. And of course, at the Atlantic Conference between Churchill and Roosevelt, they'd already agreed that we'd go Germany first. But how on earth does Roosevelt convince people that Germany first is going to be the strategy without Hitler actually declaring war himself? I mean, it's absolutely fatal. What I think is really interesting here is that coincident with obviously the attack on Pearl Harbor, or indeed anywhere where the Americans are engaged, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declares war on the United States. Absolutely astonishing move. When his troops are bogged down, as we know, on the Eastern Front in Barbarossa just before Moscow. We've got a lot going on in North Africa, of course, ahead of what we know as El Alamein. And so right at the point where Germany is really, really sort of up to its neck in things, they declare war on the United States with its vast industrial and manpower capacity. Of course, it was in honouring the tripartite pact that Hitler did it. But it has an immense effect, of course, on the strategy of the war. It gives leadership to the Americans immediately because Hitler decides on a whim that he's going to declare war on the United States.
I mean, that is so interesting. And in a way, maybe that's the key thing about Pearl Harbor. It's not so much whether the attack could have played out differently. It's more the fact that once it happened, the various responses from the US and from the Axis powers, etc. I mean, let's say, for example, John, Hitler does probably what would have been the strategically wise thing and doesn't declare war on the US. I think we all know that. Then what happens? I mean, presumably Roosevelt has to pursue the Pacific first.
Yeah, which from Churchill's standpoint is a bad thing. I mean, the last thing that the British want is to have the American attention yoinked over to the Pacific and start ignoring what's going on in Great Britain. And so, Hitler gives Roosevelt a tremendous political gift when he decides to, actually declare war. But to that point, I would say that the U.S. is eventually going to be in a shooting war in the Atlantic in any case. We're already taking pot shots from German U-boats. They've sunk one of our destroyers, the Reuben James. That happened just a couple months ago. And so I think eventually you're going to get a situation where we're going to make the decision, okay, the Germans are still taking pot shots at our destroyers. We need to get in this thing, and we're going to get a war out of that in any case. Because among other things, Admiral Donitz, the head of the German submarine force, he too has got spittle running down his chin. He wants to make the Americans fight for the sea lanes. This whole business of American neutrality is looking pretty flimsy at this point. It's clear that the Americans are on the British side. So I think there's going to be a war with Germany. I just don't know when that's going to happen.
And very briefly, John, if Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, do you still get the nuclear arms race? Does the bomb get dropped?
Yeah, on somebody. Yes, because
I think there's another
issue. That decision's already been made.
I think there's another issue.
We're already getting into that game.
I think there's another issue here as well, of course. If this attack on Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, you actually have Admiral Kimmel in place as the Pac Fleet commander. You also have Admiral Betty, as he was known, Betty Stark, as the Chief of Naval Operations. Now, they were replaced respectively by Admiral Nimitz and also by Admiral King, who I very much admire. Fantastic strategic thinker.
So does Midway play out differently?
Well, does the Pacific War play out differently? And do these personalities have enough sort of willpower to stand up to General MacArthur, who is the major domo in the South Pacific? So the whole personality issue associated with this, I would say, and forgive me, obviously I'm not an American, the Japanese do you a favor by attacking you at Pearl Harbor, because not only does it get you in the war with real grievance, but also replaces your top naval commanders with seriously good people who can then take on the Pacific campaign.
Yeah,
100%.
You agree with that, John?
Absolutely in agreement with. Completely. If you look at the caliber of the two people that we end up putting into those two roles, they are immensely superior to, Betty Stark and Admiral Kimmel.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Thank you both so much. So many what ifs, but that's the beauty of History Undone. And I think what's interesting with this one in particular, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, is that maybe the Japanese had to do something because they needed the natural resources, and wherever they attacked, they were going to provoke some kind of American response. But maybe the key thing is the response from the Germans. Maybe it's the fact that Hitler declares war on the US in the wake of it. And had that not happened, things may have played out very, very differently. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to John Parshall and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. We will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel History Undone with James Hanson on YouTube. And you can also catch me presenting Frontline on Times Radio. Goodbye.